There is one target in this entire war that matters more than any other single objective either side has gone after. It isn't a missile site. It isn't an airbase. It's a small coral island in the northern Persian Gulf that most people had never heard of 6 months ago, Kharg Island. And the fight over what happens to it may end up defining how this entire war concludes. Let's break down exactly what Kharg Island is, why it's become the single most consequential flashpoint of this conflict, what's actually been confirmed versus what's still a threat on the table, and what it would really mean if the United States followed through on taking it. Kharg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, not far off Iran's coast near Bushehr. It's small. You could walk across most of it in under an hour, but it is, without exaggeration, the single most important piece of infrastructure the Iranian government controls. Pipelines from Iran's largest oil fields converge there. Tankers load directly from its terminal. By most estimates, Kharg handles somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of all Iranian crude oil exports, with a loading capacity in the range of 7 million barrels a day. Strip away everything else about this war for a second and just sit with that fact. 90%. That's not one revenue stream among several for the Islamic Republic. That's close to the entire revenue stream. Whoever controls what happens at that terminal controls whether the Iranian government has money to run itself. That's exactly why, as this war has ground on, Kharg Island has moved from being a secondary target to being the target both sides understand as decisive. Back in mid-March, U.S. forces carried out a large bombing operation against military infrastructure on Kharg Island. Reportedly, dozens of separate military sites, including facilities tied to naval mines and missile systems Iran had been using to threaten the Strait of Hormuz. The stated American position at the time was specific and, frankly, restrained given what was available as a target. The strikes hit military assets on the island, but deliberately avoided the oil and gas infrastructure itself. The administration described this as a matter of proportionality. Hit the military capability without destroying an economic asset that, in the wrong strike, could have triggered a much bigger spike in global energy markets and a much bigger humanitarian and economic fallout inside Iran. But that restraint came with an explicit warning attached to it. If Iran continued closing or threatening the Strait of Hormuz, or continued attacking commercial shipping, that decision not to hit the oil infrastructure would be reconsidered. That warning is the thread that connects March to where we are now. Fast forward through a ceasefire that held only briefly and then collapsed. By June, the American position had hardened considerably. The administration signaled, publicly on the record, that it was prepared to go after Iran's energy infrastructure directly this time, and specifically floated the idea of the United States assuming operational control over Kharg Island and Iran's broader oil and gas exports, rather than simply striking and withdrawing. I want to be precise about where things actually stand, because this is a case where the difference between threatened and confirmed matters enormously. What we know for certain, the ceasefire broke down. The U.S. resumed strikes. Iran responded by continuing attacks on shipping in and around the strait, and on partner nation bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. The U.S., in turn, has enforced a naval blockade against tankers attempting to move Iranian crude, including disabling at least one commercial vessel that ignored repeated warnings while approaching Kharg. Oil prices have moved sharply on exactly this uncertainty, pushing past $80 a barrel as markets price, in the real possibility that the terminal handling 90% of Iran's exports could go offline or change hands entirely. What remains, as of the most recent reporting, somewhere between confirmed and still unfolding, is the full scope of an actual seizure and permanent American operational control of the terminal itself, as opposed to further strikes on military targets located there. That's an important distinction to hold on to, because a lot of commentary, including plenty you'll see elsewhere on this platform, blurs the line between the president has said this is on the table and this has definitively happened. I'd rather you hear the accurate version from me than the more dramatic version from someone chasing clicks. Here's the part that I think deserves the most attention, because it's a genuine inflection point in how this conflict has been fought. Every prior phase of this war, however intense, however many strike packages, however many nights of tomahawks and fighter sorties, has been framed accurately as degradation. Destroy the missile that can hit a tanker. Destroy the radar that can guide an attack. Destroy the boats that can threaten the strait. That's a military campaign aimed at removing capability. Taking operational control of Kharg Island is a fundamentally different category of action. It's not about destroying something Iran can rebuild. It's about redirecting something Iran depends on to survive as a government. If the revenue that flows through that terminal stops reaching Tehran and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's not a dent in military capability. That's a direct hit on the institutional machinery that pays personnel, funds the regional network of aligned groups stretching from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, and keeps the weapons programs funded. You can rebuild a radar site. You cannot rebuild a national budget that's been cut off at the source. That's precisely why this specific target has been treated so differently by the American side throughout this war. struck for its military value back in March, deliberately spared on the economic side at that time, and now sitting at the center of the most serious escalation threat either side has put on the table. And it's exactly why, if Iran's leadership has been operating on the assumption that this war eventually pauses long enough for them to reconstitute, rearm, rebuild, regroup, and come back from a stronger position, the way they appear to have used the last ceasefire, losing Kharg Island removes the financial floor that assumption depends on. Running alongside the strikes has been a naval blockade effort aimed specifically at Iranian oil exports, and it's worth spending a minute on how that's actually being enforced, because it tells you something about how deliberately this campaign has been calibrated. U.S. forces have disabled at least one commercial tanker that was attempting to reach Kharg Island in violation of the blockade, after the vessel reportedly ignored multiple warnings. The way that's been done matters. This isn't indiscriminate targeting of merchant shipping. It's precision use of force against the propulsion and steering systems of a specific non-compliant vessel, intended to stop the ship rather than destroy it or its crew. That's a deliberate signal. Every other tanker operator watching that outcome now has to weigh whether attempting to run Iranian crude through the blockade is worth the risk of losing their vessel's ability to move. Combine that blockade enforcement with the reduced flow through Kharg's terminal, and you start to see the outlines of an economic strategy that's running in parallel with the military one. Strangle the revenue on the export side while degrading the military capability that would otherwise protect that revenue. Two tracks, converging on the same institution. I think it's worth stepping back and asking plainly why Iran's government has been unwilling to bring this to a negotiated close, because I don't think the answer is simply stubbornness. The Strait of Hormuz and Iran's ability to threaten shipping through it functions as leverage, a way of forcing outside powers to take Iranian objections seriously because of the economic cost of ignoring them. Kharg Island is the revenue base underneath everything else, the money that funds the regional network of aligned armed groups, funds the IRGC's own institutional structure, and funds whatever remains of Iran's weapons development ambitions, including the nuclear program that has been the central sticking point of essentially every round of diplomacy in this conflict. Any negotiated resolution that actually holds is going to require addressing all three of those layers simultaneously: the immediate military exchange, the economic lifeline running through Kharg, and the underlying nuclear question. Because a ceasefire that leaves any one of them untouched just resets the clock until the next flashpoint. That's been the pattern of this war from the beginning. Informal understandings that collapse the moment one side calculates it has more to gain from resuming strikes than from holding the pause. It's easy to watch this as a two-country conflict, but the Kharg Island question in particular has pulled in stakeholders well beyond Washington and Tehran. Oil markets have already priced in real uncertainty. Crude pushing past $80 a barrel on exactly this news. That's not an abstract number. It moves fuel costs, shipping costs, and inflation calculations for economies with no direct stake in this war at all. European governments and energy-dependent economies, who've mostly kept a diplomatic distance from the American military campaign up to this point, now have a much more direct interest in how the Kharg question resolves, because pricing and supply dynamics engulf crude ripple straight through to their own energy security. And regionally, every partner nation hosting American forces, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, is watching this specific decision closely, because a move as significant as taking direct control of Iran's primary oil export terminal would represent a level of American commitment to this conflict that goes well beyond degrading military targets. That has implications for how long those partner nations expect to be living under the kind of rolling alert posture we've already talked about in previous updates. So where does this leave us? Based on what's actually been confirmed rather than what's been threatened, the United States has struck military targets on Kharg Island once already, deliberately sparing the oil infrastructure at that time. The ceasefire that followed collapsed. The administration has since said publicly that a more direct move against Iran's oil exports in Kharg Island itself is on the table and has already begun enforcing a naval blockade with real consequences for tankers that test it. Oil markets are treating the threat as credible enough to move prices. What hasn't happened, as of this recording, is a confirmed, sustained American assumption of permanent operational control over the terminal itself. That is still, as far as verified reporting shows, a stated intention and an active threat rather than a completed fact. I want to be honest with you about that distinction because I think it matters for understanding what actually comes next rather than what makes for the most dramatic headline. If it does happen, if Kharg Island's revenue stops flowing to Tehran, I think that's the single event most likely to force a genuine change in Iranian negotiating behavior, because it removes the financial cushion that's allowed the Iranian government to absorb months of military losses without changing its fundamental position. Whether that produces a faster resolution to this war, or whether it produces an even more determined and desperate Iranian response, is the honest, open question. I don't think anyone, including people in rooms far more informed than this one, knows that answer yet. That's the picture on Kharg Island as it actually stands right now. Not the most dramatic version of the story, but the version I can actually stand behind. A single terminal handling roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. A March strike that hit the military targets and spared the economic ones. A collapsed ceasefire. A blockade already disabling tankers that test it. And a stated American intention to go further that, if it's carried out, would represent the most consequential single move of this entire war. I'll keep tracking this one closely because I think it matters more than almost anything else happening in this conflict right now. If you want me to keep breaking down developments like this as they're confirmed, not as they're rumored, let me know in the comments and I'll keep bringing you the updates as fast as the facts on the ground actually justify them. Last time, I walked you through what Kharg Island actually is, what's been confirmed about strikes and threats against it, and why I think it's the single most consequential flashpoint in this entire war. A lot of you asked the obvious next question in the comments. Okay, so what actually happens if this goes further? What does the blockade look like from here? What does a world with Kharg Island offline, or under different control, actually mean for Iran, for the region, for the rest of us watching oil prices at the pump? That's what I want to dig into today. Not more headlines. The actual mechanics of what a prolonged standoff over this one island does to everyone connected to it. Before we go further, I want to make sure everyone watching understands why the Strait of Hormuz and Kharg Island are really two halves of the same story, because I think that connection gets lost in the day-to-day coverage. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point, the narrow passage between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that a huge share of the world's seaborne oil has to pass through to reach global markets. Kharg Island is the source, the terminal where Iran's own crude gets loaded onto the tankers that then have to run that choke point. You can't meaningfully threaten one without the other becoming relevant. If Iran wants leverage over global shipping, it uses the strait. If outside powers want leverage over Iran specifically, they look at Kharg. That's part of why this war has produced such a strange, almost mirrored escalation pattern. Iran threatening to close the strait to pressure the world, the US threatening to take Kharg to pressure Iran. Two choke points, two different kinds of leverage, both converging on the same 50-mile stretch of water. Let's talk mechanics for a minute, because blockade is a word that gets used loosely, and I think it's worth being precise about what it actually means in this context. A naval blockade enforced against tanker traffic doesn't need to sink ships to be effective. It needs to make the cost of running it higher than the value of the cargo. What we've already seen confirmed is exactly that kind of enforcement. A vessel ignoring repeated warnings gets disabled, not sunk, and the message travels through the entire shipping industry instantly. Insurers take notice. Shipping companies take notice. Within days of an incident like that, war risk insurance premiums for any vessel transiting anywhere near Iranian waters spike. And a lot of commercial operators simply decide the run isn't worth it regardless of what Iran is offering to pay. That's the quiet, less dramatic half of how a blockade actually strangles a target economy. It's not just about the ships the US Navy directly stops. It's about the 100 other ships that never even attempt the run because the insurance math stopped working. Over a period of weeks, that compounds. Iran doesn't just lose the cargo on the one disabled tanker. It loses access to the global commercial shipping market that was willing to carry its oil in the first place. I want to talk through what this actually looks like on the ground inside Iran, because I don't think the strategic level conversation about cutting off regime revenue fully captures what that means for the people living under it. Oil revenue in Iran doesn't just fund missile programs and proxy networks, although it absolutely funds both of those. It also funds fuel subsidies, currency stabilization, imports of everything from medicine to spare parts for aging infrastructure, and government salaries across a huge swath of the economy that exists inside or adjacent to state-run enterprises. When that revenue gets squeezed, the pressure doesn't land first on the IRGC's weapons budget. It lands first on ordinary economic life, currency depreciation, inflation on imported goods, and rolling infrastructure strain. The kind we've already been seeing reported in the form of blackouts and fuel shortages, well before any Kharg Island escalation. That's the uncomfortable truth, sitting underneath the strategic chess piece framing that a lot of war coverage falls into. Squeezing Kharg Island's revenue is, by design, meant to squeeze the institutions that fund the war. But institutions and civilian populations share the same national economy, and there is no clean way to cut off one without the pressure reaching the other. I think that's worth saying plainly because it's the part of this story that doesn't fit neatly into either a triumphant, we're winning narrative or a purely tactical breakdown of strike packages. This isn't the first time a war has turned on control of a single piece of energy infrastructure, and I think the historical pattern is instructive for figuring out where this might go. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Kharg Island itself was repeatedly targeted by Iraqi forces. damaging its terminal badly enough that Iran had to shift meaningful export volume to smaller, less efficient facilities elsewhere along its coast. Iran survived that war, but its oil economy took years to recover afterward, and the disruption to Gulf shipping during that conflict, what came to be known as the tanker war phase, pushed insurance costs and global oil prices up for years, well beyond the direct combatants. The broader lesson from that history, and from other energy choke point conflicts since, is that this kind of pressure works, but it works slowly and unevenly. It rarely produces the kind of sudden capitulation that a single dramatic strike might suggest. What it tends to produce instead is a long, grinding erosion of the targeted economy's ability to function normally, followed eventually by either a negotiated settlement once the pain becomes politically unsustainable for the leadership absorbing it, or a hardening of that leadership's position as it digs in around whatever resources it has left. Which of those two outcomes we get here is genuinely not something I think anyone can call with confidence right now. One of the reasons Kharg Island has become such a central target is that Iranian oil revenue doesn't stay inside Iran's borders. It's the financial backbone of a regional network of aligned armed groups and political movements that stretches from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq and beyond. Groups that have, at various points throughout this broader regional conflict, opened their own fronts in support of or in coordination with Tehran. If that funding pipeline gets meaningfully disrupted, the effects don't stay contained to the direct US-Iran fight. Groups that depend on that support for salaries, weapons resupply, and operational funding face their own internal pressure, which can either force them to scale back activity or, in some cases, push them toward more aggressive action in an attempt to demonstrate continued relevance and capability while resources tighten. That's part of why regional partners well outside the immediate battle space, across the wider Middle East, are watching the Kharg Island question as closely as Washington and Tehran are. The financial disruption at the source has second and third order effects that ripple through every front connected to that funding network. I keep coming back to this question because it's the one that matters most to anyone watching this war and wondering when it ends. What would an actual off-ramp look like at this stage? Based on everything we've covered, I think any durable resolution has to address three things simultaneously, not sequentially. First, an enforceable arrangement around the Strait of Hormuz that both restores confidence for commercial shipping and gives Iran some face-saving assurance that it isn't simply being locked out of the waterway on its own doorstep. Second, some resolution of the Kharg Island question that doesn't leave Iran's government functionally insolvent, because a negotiating partner with no ability to pay its own state apparatus is not a stable partner for anything. It's a government one shock away from either collapse or a far more desperate, unpredictable set of decisions. And third, movement on the nuclear question, since that's been the issue underneath every failed round of diplomacy in this conflict. The hard part, and I want to be honest about this, is that those three pieces pull in different directions depending on who you ask. A resolution generous enough to keep Iran's government financially viable is, to a lot of critics, indistinguishable from rewarding the behavior that started this phase of the war. A resolution harsh enough to fully satisfy those critics risks producing exactly the kind of desperate, cornered response that makes any negotiated outcome impossible in the first place. Finding the version of this that both sides can actually accept and that regional partners can live with is an extraordinarily narrow needle to thread. I don't think it's impossible. I do think it's further away than a lot of optimistic diplomatic language has suggested at various points in this war. If you want to track this yourself instead of waiting for the next update from me, here's what I'd be watching. Watch oil prices. They're one of the most honest, real-time indicators of how seriously markets are pricing in a genuine escalation around Kharg versus just another round of rhetoric. Watch tanker insurance and shipping industry reporting, since that tells you how the commercial world, not the political world, is actually behaving in response to the blockade. Watch for any change in the language coming out of CENTCOM specifically, since operational statements from the military tend to be more precise and less rhetorical than statements from political leadership on either side. And watch what happens with the aligned groups outside Iran's borders, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, because a real disruption in Iranian funding tends to show up first as a change in their operational tempo, before it shows up in any official Iranian statement. So that's part two. Kharg Island isn't just a target. It's the fulcrum this entire war is balanced on, economically and strategically. A blockade that doesn't need to sink ships to work. An Iranian economy where military and civilian pressure can't actually be separated from each other. A regional funding network that extends the stakes of this one island's fate well beyond Iran's own borders. And a diplomatic path forward that exists in theory, but requires threading a needle narrower than almost anyone commenting on this war, myself included, is fully accounting for. I'll keep bringing you these breakdowns as the facts actually develop, not as the rumors do. If there's a specific angle on this you want me to go deeper on next, the shipping and insurance side, the regional proxy network, the history of the tanker war in the 80s? Tell me in the comments, and I'll build the next one around it. It's been a few days since my last update, and honestly, this conflict has moved fast enough that a lot of what I told you then needs an update now. We're looking at a 10th consecutive night of strikes. The American death toll has climbed again. There's a new target on the table that's arguably more consequential than Kharg Island. And there's a fresh front opening up hundreds of miles away that most people watching this war haven't even heard about yet. Let's go through what's actually confirmed right now as of today. I have to start here because the number has changed since we last talked. 17 American service members have now died since this war began. That's up from the figure I gave you in an earlier update, and it reflects just how relentless the pace of this conflict has stayed over the past several days. Alongside that, the Pentagon has acknowledged that nearly 100 U.S. service members have suffered some level of injury since the fighting resumed in early July, mostly described as minor, but confirmed. It's also been reported that the military has been slow to fully disclose the scope of those injuries as this war has ground on, which is worth flagging, because an accurate picture of the human cost of this conflict depends on that kind of disclosure, happening in real time, not months later. 2 of the service members lost in the Jordan attack I covered in an earlier update have now been formally identified. I'm not going to read out names and hometowns as a dramatic device. That's not the kind of channel I want to run. But I'll say this. Every one of these was a real person with a real family that's now living through the worst week of their lives. Keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this, because it's easy to talk about strike packages and target sets and lose the thread of what all of it actually costs. The operational tempo here is genuinely remarkable from a purely military standpoint. We are now on a 10th consecutive night of American strikes against Iran. That's not a single dramatic raid. That's a sustained campaign, night after night, which tells you the current phase of this war is not a limited retaliatory action. It's a continuous operation. President Trump has framed the pace of this campaign directly, saying strikes would continue hitting Iran hard on consecutive nights, and CENTCOM has echoed that language in its own statements, describing the strikes as intended to keep imposing sustained cost on Iranian forces. The U.S. has also been reinforcing the region materially, additional F-16 and F-35 squadrons moving in from bases in Europe, along with more aerial refueling tankers, which is exactly the kind of infrastructure buildup that lets a campaign like this keep up a nightly tempo without running out of gas, literally mid-operation. That kind of sustained reinforcement tells you something important. This isn't being run as a short punitive strike that winds down once the message is sent. It's being resourced like an operation the Pentagon expects to keep running for a while. Here's the development I think deserves the most attention out of everything that's happened in the last week, because it may end up mattering even more than Kharg Island. There's a site in central Iran, near Natanz, that's come to be known publicly as Pickaxe Mountain. In Farsi, Ku-i-Kolang. It's a fortified underground facility, reportedly buried under hundreds of meters of granite, that Iran has described as a centrifuge assembly plant, though international inspectors have not been granted access to independently verify that. Construction appears to have begun around 2020, and satellite imagery has shown Iran actively hardening and sealing tunnel entrances there in the months since the war began, which is exactly the kind of behavior you'd expect from a facility meant to survive an air campaign. President Trump has explicitly named this site as a target, saying directly that the U.S. intends to strike it, describing it as a shot right in the front door. What makes this different from most of the targets we've discussed so far is the technical question of whether it's even reachable. Analysts have pointed out that the depth of this facility may put it beyond the effective range of America's largest conventional bunker buster weapon, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the same weapon that was used against Iran's Fordo site in prior strikes. If that assessment is accurate, an attempt to hit Pickaxe Mountain would be pushing right up against the technical limits of what current American conventional weapons can actually accomplish against a target this deeply buried. This matters strategically for a reason that goes beyond the military hardware question. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran had amassed a substantial stockpile of highly enriched uranium, reportedly enough, if further enriched for multiple weapons, before the 2025 strikes, with significant quantities believed to be dispersed and stored deep underground at sites including this one, and facilities near Isfahan. If Pickaxe Mountain is functioning as a facility meant to preserve or continue that program specifically because it's difficult to reach from the air, then whether or not it can actually be destroyed becomes one of the most consequential open questions of this entire war. Now here's something that's gotten far less coverage than it deserves, and I think that's a mistake, because it represents this war spreading to an entirely new stretch of water. According to multiple sourcing, Iran's leadership has discussed using the Houthi movement in Yemen to threaten closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point at the southern end of the Red Sea, separate entirely from the Strait of Hormuz we've spent the last 2 updates talking about. Sources close to the Houthis have indicated missiles and drones have already been positioned near that waterway, with the group reportedly awaiting an order to begin targeting shipping there. Think about what that would mean if it's carried out. Up to now, this war's choke point pressure has been concentrated on a single passage, Hormuz. If the Houthis open a second front at Bab el-Mandeb, you're now looking at 2 of the world's most critical shipping choke points under simultaneous threat on opposite sides of the Arabian Peninsula. That would be an enormous escalation in the economic dimension of this war, potentially forcing even more shipping traffic to reroute entirely around Africa, adding weeks to shipping times and pushing costs up further across the board. President Trump has already responded to reporting on this with a blunt warning that the U.S. will take care of business if that threat materializes. This is exactly the kind of second-order escalation I flagged as a risk in my last update. Funding and proxy pressure pushing aligned groups toward more aggressive action rather than less. It looks like that's exactly what may be starting to play out. In the middle of all this escalation, there's one genuinely notable diplomatic signal that's emerged in just the last day. President Trump has said publicly that he believes Iran desperately wants to return to the table for ceasefire talks. That's a notably different tone than most of the rhetoric we've been tracking through this war, and it's worth taking seriously as a data point, even if it's a single comment rather than a confirmed negotiating breakthrough. It fits into a broader pattern that's actually been running the whole time underneath the strikes. Delegations from the U.S. and Iran did enter formal negotiations back in June, built around a memorandum of understanding both countries signed, aimed at ending the war. That framework technically still exists. What's happened since is that both sides have continued trading strikes anyway, particularly after Iran struck commercial vessels that had bypassed a pre-approved shipping route through the strait in early July, which is what triggered this current, more intense phase of the conflict in the first place. So here's the honest read. There's an actual diplomatic track running in parallel with the military one, and there's now a fresh signal that Iran may be more willing to re-engage with it than the daily strike headlines would suggest. But we've seen this pattern before in this war. An opening appears, and then a new triggering event pulls both sides right back into escalation before anything concrete gets signed. I'd treat this as a genuinely hopeful sign worth watching closely, not as evidence the war is about to end. A couple of other threads worth tracking briefly. Kuwait intercepted hostile targets in the last day. Sirens sounded again in Bahrain, and Jordan reported downing additional Iranian missiles. So the rolling regional alert posture I described in earlier updates hasn't eased at all. If anything, it's continued at the same intensity. Separately, and somewhat apart from the direct Iran fight, there's a parallel diplomatic process underway involving Lebanon. A tripartite framework agreement recently signed between Lebanon, the U.S., and Israel, with the Lebanese army now deploying forces in the country's south as part of implementing it. President Trump met with Lebanon's president at the White House this week as part of that process. It's a reminder that this conflict doesn't exist in isolation. It's tangled up with several other regional negotiating tracks happening at the same time, some of which are actually making progress even while the core U.S.-Iran fight continues. So here's where things actually stand, as accurately as I can give it to you today. 17 Americans dead, nearly 100 injured, 10 consecutive nights of strikes with reinforcements still flowing into the region, a potential new target at Pickaxe Mountain that may sit right at the edge of what American weapons can physically reach, a possible second choke point front opening at Bab el-Mandeb through the Houthis, and running underneath all of it, a diplomatic track that technically still exists and just got a notably more optimistic comment attached to it, even if I don't think that's enough yet to call this anywhere close to over. I'll keep tracking every piece of this as it's confirmed. If you want the next update focused specifically on the Pickaxe Mountain targeting question or on what a Bab el-Mandeb front would actually mean for global shipping, tell me in the comments and I'll build the next one around it. Take care of each other. I'll see you in the next one.